I just watched a video about bike fit that you absolutely must watch, especially if you like to do more than just sit on the seat and pedal around. So, Joy of Bike with Lee Likes Bikes. I'll explain to you why this is so important.
There we go. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. That was so fun. Wow. Tree. Yes. You get to see Biff number 2.
Okay, so I was going through YouTube and I saw this, how to fit a mountain bike to your body. So I'm going to link this video in the description and you'll see this little clip right here.
A familiar seated reach. And that's how most people pick bikes. You go around the parking lot, you're like, oh, this feels about right. In our world, we're concerned with the rider area distance, which is the distance between your hands and your feet. And our goal is to make that distance and angle such that you can dynamically lock yourself into the bike.
Okay, so for any of you that have been around for a while, one of the ways we used to always measure mountain bikes and road bikes, I specifically say mountain bikes and not BMX bikes in this case, because since the late 80s, early 90s, we started measuring BMX bikes by the top tube length. Before that, BMX bikes were always pretty short and you would put a longer stem on them and all this silly stuff to make it fit you better, bigger bars, longer stem. Then in the late 80s, early 90s, it's like, hey, taller rider, longer frame. It's only been recently, like as in the last 10 years and even the last 5 years, that mountain bike geometry has drastically changed in their way of thinking about how you size a bike. So if you look at how we used to size mountain bikes, you used to always go by this G. And if you look at what G is here in the chart, G is seat tube length, right? So we would measure from center bottom bracket, sometimes even just to the top of the top tube, not so much to the top of the seat tube, because that was kind of how you'd guess stand over. But either way, different bike companies did it differently. But the idea is you'd have like a smaller frame was like a 13-inch, and you had like a 15-inch, and then you had like a 17-inch, and then some companies went even numbers, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, right? And it's like, oh, what size is your frame? Oh, it's a 21-inch frame. Oh, you must be a super tall rider. Yeah, right? Fast forward to today, and it's not like that at all anymore. There's a little bit of added length in the seat tube as the bike size get bigger, but the key factor in bike size are these two numbers here, these two measurements, I should say, A and B. And B is actually more important than A. And if you watch that video, it'll explain. And what they talk about is they talk about the distance between center and bottom bracket to where your grips are and how that measures with your body, because everybody has different length legs and different length arms and different length torsos and stuff. So just because you may be 5'9", that doesn't mean you're going to ride the same bike as somebody else who's 5'9", because maybe they have a longer torso, and so their fists come up higher from the ground and things like that. So that rad that they call it is a very important number, so that's why you need to go watch that video. But let's talk a little bit about this measurement right here, which is what they call your, let's see, what is it here, B, I think they call it reach here. Yeah, right here, reach. So these are your numbers that are going to actually matter. It wasn't that long ago, and this is just because of BMX. I used to go by more like the effective top tube length. So the difference between BMX and mountain biking is BMX, you generally will have the top tube will be close enough to parallel to the ground where you can get away with measuring just the top tube length. And mountain biking, this angle gets really steep sometimes, and with full suspension frames it's all over the place, so it's much easier to measure this effective top tube. The issue with this is effective top tube is only measuring your seated length. So your butt's back here and you're holding onto the handlebars, and up until, you know, like I said, the last 10 years, the big focus on mountain bikes was, hey, you're going to be seated and you're going to be holding on to the bars. How does the bike climb? Yada, yada, yada. But as more and more mountain bikers started doing more jumping and more, you know, technical terrain and pump tracks and all that stuff, you realize that you're going to be standing most of the time. So you're going to be over the bottom bracket and reaching for your handlebars, and that's why the reach has become a much bigger factor in how you size a bike. And what's interesting is it's really hard to say, oh, this is your reach, let's go by that. You could, but that video explains this other measurement, which is a really good way to think about it, because that's gonna have to do with your body, how long your arms are, how long your torsos are, how long your legs are, all those different things, because everybody's a little different in that sense. So coming back to here, I used to always measure by top tube length, and I was like, oh, it's got to be, you know, 23 inches or more, which, you know, 590 is close to that. Then we start getting longer, and I do ride a small, and so the 420 number is much more important because I'm going to be standing doing technical things on my bike, and that's when I want to make sure my bike is doing what it needs to do. That video also talks about how seat tube angles have gotten a lot steeper. They do help climbing and keeping the front wheel down. What they do is they shorten your seated distance. So nowadays when you sit on a bike, you're going to be in a more upright position, and the handlebars are going to feel closer to you on modern bike geometry. And for some people, they're going to think that's awkward, but to those of us in the know, we think that that's ideal, because we're thinking about what is the bike going to ride like when we're standing, since anytime we're doing anything technical, we want to be out of the saddle. So it's just a totally different way to think about geometry than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago when it comes to mountain bikes. And I'm happy to see that the bike industry, at least in the mountain bike world, have finally started really grasping how you size a bike in a better way. I mean, they've been doing it for, it's been a slow evolution for probably the last 15 years. If you go back even into the late 90s, Gary Fisher started talking about this Genesis geometry, and that was like, to me, like, wow, he's talking about longer top tubes, you know, things like that, and not so much about how tall the bike is. And so that was kind of the beginning, and then over the course of the last 20 years we've gotten into this much more aggressive way of doing things. So I just wanted to touch on that and get you to start thinking a little differently, especially if you're more old school and you think this G measurement is the most important measurement on a bike frame. Road bike, by all means, you're seated most of the time on a road bike. The geometries are a little different. Once we start getting into gravel bikes and other bikes, they start to take a little bit into account more aggressive stuff, because you will be standing sometimes and things like that. So really, you know, it really depends on the kind of bike that you're riding. But for mountain bikes, unless you're pure cross-country racer that's going to be seated most of the time and do lots and lots of climbing, And even those bikes are starting to evolve a little bit to handle more technical terrain because the courses are getting more technical for cross-country riding. So yeah, whole bunch to think about here. Definitely watch that video. I will have it linked. Lee Likes Bikes. I've been watching their series on Joy a Bike, and they have it figured out. Super awesome. And I love it that they're older and they're talking about this stuff. Okay, so I hope this info helps you out some. Definitely watch that video. I've said it a bunch of times, but it's super cool what they show in that video, and that measurement is super important. One of the things I want to caution, especially if you feel like your cockpit's too small when you're seated, is do not add a longer stem on your bike. The longest stem you should ever have on your mountain bike with the modern geometry bike is 50 millimeters. 55 might be pushing it a little bit, but you could get away with it. But I run like a 35 or 40 millimeter stem on almost all my mountain bikes. And then sometimes I go with a little higher rise handlebar because I feel like that helps me control the bike a little bit better. But adding longer stems is no longer a way to size a bike. We stopped doing it in the BMX world a long time ago, and now BMX stems are running even shorter, and we're running our frames a little bit longer even now. So it's just kind of an interesting progression over the years on how these things play into how a bike should be sized. But it's definitely all about the frame and not so much about stem and all these other things you may tweak. You have little subtle adjustments. You can go little adjustments with the stem, or you can slide your seat forward and back on the rails a little bit to fine-tune things. But for the most part, you want it to be the frame that is determining proper bike fit. I really appreciate your support from my channel. Please like and subscribe. Peace.